1967, two men pointed a camera at something in the woods. What they captured has haunted America for 60 years. Welcome to local legends. The forest that afternoon was not silent. Water rushed over stones somewhere distant, masked by the rustling of Douglas firs that climbed the slope in ranks, their trunks dark with moisture. October light fell in shafts through the canopy, pale gold striping the forest floor where ferns grew waste. High and rotting logs lay collapsed into moss and lichen. The air smelled of wet bark and earth turned over by winter rains that had come early to Northern California. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin had been riding for hours, their horses picking their way along Bluff Creek, a tributary system that fed into the Klamath River basin. The terrain here was folded and steep, ridges rising abruptly from narrow valleys choked with underbrush. No roads, no trail markers, just the creek bed and the patience required to follow it. Patterson carried a rented 16mm Cine Kodak camera in his saddlebag. He'd been looking for tracks. Instead, at 1:15 in the afternoon on the 20th of October, 1967, approximately 25 miles from the nearest paved road, he filmed something that would become the single most analyzed piece of cryptid evidence in modern history. The figure was massive, covered in dark hair, walking upright on two legs with a fluid, swinging gait. It moved across a sandbar, turned once to look directly at the camera, then disappeared into the timber. The footage lasted 59.5 seconds. Nearly 6 decades later, no laboratory, no film expert, no zoologist, no digital forensics team has definitively proven it to be a hoax. And in those 59.5 seconds, Patterson and Gimlin gave a face to something the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest had known by name for thousands of years. The creature in the film, the figure that has resisted every attempt at debunking, is what the Halkomelem, speaking peoples of the Fraser Valley, called Sasq'ets, the wild man of the woods. The Pacific Northwest is a kingdom of verticality and shadow, from the Olympic Peninsula, south, through the Cascade Range, down the spine of the Coast Ranges into Northern California. The landscape rises in tiers: temperate rainforest at sea level, subalpine meadows above 5,000 feet, volcanic peaks breaking 10,000, Douglas fir, western red cedar, Sitka spruce. Canopies so dense that in summer the forest floor remains in permanent dusk. Annual rainfall in some valleys exceeds 140 inches. In others, fog rolls inland every morning and burns off by noon, leaving the trees dripping. This is old forest, what forestry biologists call late successional. Trees 400 years old, some older, their roots interlocking beneath soil layered with centuries of decomposition. In winter, snowpack accumulates at elevation. In spring, rivers swell and reshape their channels. The land is not static. It shifts, collapses, regenerates. For the Coast Salish peoples, a linguistic and cultural group spanning the inland waterways and coastal regions from the Strait of Georgia south to the Columbia River, this was never empty wilderness. It was home. The Lummi, Snoqualmie, Squaxin Island, Cowlitz, Snohomish, and dozens of other nations held intimate knowledge of these forests. They knew which hillsides produced the best cedar for canoes, where salmon spawned, when to harvest camas bulbs. They built longhouses from split planks, stored dried fish in elevated caches, and organized their social and spiritual lives around seasonal cycles. Their cosmology was not abstract. It was embedded in place. Mountains were ancestors. Rivers had intentions. Animals were persons with whom one negotiated. And in the deep forest, beyond the village perimeters, beyond the berry, picking grounds and the hunting paths, there existed beings that occupied a liminal category, neither fully animal nor fully human, not spirits in the incorporeal sense, but entities possessed of consciousness, agency, and power. The Salish word Sasq'ets appears in early ethnographic records, as early as the 1920s, though the oral traditions surrounding the figure extend back countless generations. for the Lummi Nation of Whatcom County, Washington. The being was known as Tadzmequis. The Quinault called it Seatco. Among the Cowlitz, it was skeleton. Each name carried slightly different connotations, but the core attributes overlapped. A large, hair-covered humanoid that lived in isolation, possessed great strength, and generally avoided human contact. The creature was not worshipped. Its presence was a fact of the landscape, like rock slides or sudden storms. Elders taught children not to wander too far into the timber alone, not to call out in the mountains after dark, not to mock or provoke what lived beyond the firelight. Respect was the governing principle. The forest provided salmon, elk, berries, medicine plants, wood for tools and shelter. But it also demanded humility. To treat it as inert material, to ignore its animate presence, was to invite misfortune. The being called Sasq'ets, anglicized from Sasq'ets and popularized in the mid-20th century, stands between 7 and 10 feet tall, depending on the account. Its body is covered in dark brown, reddish, brown, or black hair, sometimes described as matted, other times as sleek and well-groomed. The shoulders are exceptionally broad, often exceeding 30 inches across. The arms hang low, past the hips with a reach that would allow the creature to walk with a slight forward lean, while its knuckles graze the ground. The face is said to be flat, with a pronounced brow ridge, wide-set eyes, and a nose that lies flush with the plane of the face rather than protruding. Some witnesses describe a sagittal crest, a ridge of bone running along the top of the skull, similar to that found in male gorillas, which serves as an anchor point for powerful jaw muscles. The creature walks upright exclusively, with a gait described as smooth and unhurried, despite covering ground quickly. Stride length in measured trackways has ranged from 4 to 6 feet. The feet themselves are the most frequently documented piece of evidence. Casts have been taken since the 1950s showing prints between 14 and 20 inches. In length 5 to 7 inches wide at the ball, with 5 distinct toes. The heel is broad and flat. The arch, when visible, is either minimal or absent entirely, suggesting a foot adapted for traversing uneven terrain without the rigid arch structure, typical of modern humans who wear shoes. In terms of behavior, accounts are remarkably consistent across decades and geographic regions. The creature is nocturnal or crepuscular, most active at dawn and dusk. It is omnivorous, with a diet that appears to include roots, berries, small mammals, and fish. It does not build fires, does not use tools in the way humans do, and does not construct permanent shelters, though some reports describe rudimentary lean, toss, or nests made from branches. It is intensely curious about human activity, but avoids direct confrontation. Many encounters involve the creature observing from a distance, sometimes for hours, before withdrawing silently into denser cover. It has been heard vocalizing, long, howling calls that carry for miles, high-pitched screams, and low guttural growls. In 1974, a team of researchers in the Sierra Nevada mountains recorded a series of vocalizations near the Berry Creek area that defied identification by wildlife biologists. The sounds ranged across multiple octaves, exhibiting a tonal complexity inconsistent with known North American mammals. The creature is also reported to produce a strong, musky odor, described variously as resembling wet dog, rotting vegetation, or sulfur. This odor is not present in all encounters, leading some researchers to speculate it may be a defensive mechanism, similar to a skunk's spray, or a scent marker used during mating season. There are, however, significant variations. In the Pacific Northwest, Sasq'ets is almost universally described as reclusive and non-aggressive. In the mountains of Northern California, witnesses have reported more assertive behavior, rock throwing, chest beating, loud vocalizations that seem intended to intimidate. In the Midwest, particularly in forested regions of Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, reports describe a creature that is lighter in color, sometimes gray or even white, and more frequently associated with agricultural areas, cornfields, barns, rural properties, rather than deep wilderness. Some researchers have proposed these represent distinct populations, perhaps even subspecies, adapted to different environments. Others suggest the variations reflect cultural differences in how witnesses interpret and describe the same phenomenon. There is no single moment when a human becomes Sasquatch. Unlike the Wendigo of Algonquian tradition, a being born from cannibalism and spiritual corruption, or the European werewolf, which requires a curse or a bite, Sasquatch is not a transformed human. In the traditional Indigenous framework, it exists as a separate category of being. The Salish cosmology does not draw hard boundaries between species in the way Western taxonomy does. A bear is not merely an animal, it is a person in bear form, possessed of spirit and intention. A salmon is not merely a fish, it is an ancestor returning. Sasquatch occupies a similar ontological space, neither beast nor human, but something adjacent to both. It is often described as a guardian or custodian of the forest, a being whose presence signals that a particular area is sacred, dangerous, or simply not meant for human habitation. To encounter it is not necessarily to be in danger, but to be reminded of one's place in a hierarchy of beings that extends far beyond the human. Among the Lummi, elders spoke of Sasq'ets as a creature that punished those who violated the protocols of the forest, hunters who took more than they needed, individuals who defiled sacred sites, or those who entered the mountains without proper spiritual preparation. The being was not evil, it was enforcement, a consequence made manifest. The Queno held similar beliefs, though their term Sitko carried darker connotations. Sitko was a kidnapper of children, a creature that would snatch individuals who wandered too far from the village and carry them into the mountains, never to be seen again. Stories functioned as cautionary tales, boundary-setting mechanisms that encoded practical survival knowledge. Do not let children play unsupervised near the tree line. Do not enter the forest alone at night. These were not arbitrary taboos. They reflected real dangers, terrain that could break an ankle, predators that hunted after dark, weather that could turn lethal in minutes. By attributing agency to the landscape, by personifying its hazards in the form of Sasquatch, elders ensured the rules would be remembered and followed. The creature also appears in transformation stories, though not as the transformed subject, but as the transformer. In several Coast Salish narratives, Sasquatch interacts with the transformer figures, beings who traveled the world in the mythic past, turning people into animals, mountains, and rivers as punishment or reward. In one Snoqualmie story, a group of people who refused to share food with travelers were turned into stone, while those who showed hospitality were blessed with abundant salmon runs. Sasquatch appears in these stories as an existing presence, a witness to the transformations, a figure that predates even the reordering of the world. It is old, it has always been here. It will remain after humans are gone. This understanding of Sasquatch as ancient, as tied to the deep structure of the land, persists in contemporary Indigenous perspectives. In a 2005 interview, Lummi elder Henry Keji stated that Sasq'ets was not a subject for casual discussion. It was not entertainment. To speak of it too freely was to invite its attention, and its attention was not something to be desired. He described it as a being that watched, that judged, that knew when humans had overstepped. He did not dismiss the possibility that non-Indigenous people might encounter it, but he emphasized that without the proper cultural framework, such encounters would be misunderstood. The creature would be seen as a monster, when in fact it was simply the forest asserting itself. The first English language account of Sasquatch that reached a wide audience appeared not in a naturalist's journal or an explorer's memoir, but in a Canadian newspaper. On the 4th of July, 1884, the Daily British Colonist of Victoria, British Columbia, published a short article titled, "What is it? A strange creature captured above Yale." The piece described a creature caught by railway workers near the town of Yale on the Fraser River. It was 4 feet 7 inches tall, covered in black hair, and weighed approximately 127 pounds. The workers named it Jacko. The article claimed the creature was being held in a shed and would soon be transported to a museum for study. No follow-up article ever appeared. No museum ever received the specimen. The story vanished. Whether Jacko was a hoax, a misidentified juvenile bear, or an actual capture of something unknown remains unresolved. But the article established a pattern. Outsiders encountering something the indigenous population already knew, then struggling to categorize it within their existing frameworks. British Columbia, in the late 19th century, was a contested space. Colonial authorities were consolidating control, displacing indigenous communities, and opening the interior to resource extraction, logging, mining, railway construction. The men doing this work were often transient laborers, separated from indigenous knowledge systems, moving through landscapes they did not understand. When they reported strange tracks or saw figures moving through the trees, they had no cultural context to interpret the experience. They reached for the language available to them. Ape, wild man, missing link, terms borrowed from contemporary debates about human evolution and the search for transitional fossils. In 1793, the Spanish explorer José Mariano Mosifeo, traveling with an expedition along the Pacific coast, recorded a story told to him by the Nulth people of Vancouver Island. They described a being called Matlog, a race of giants that lived in the mountains and stole food from coastal villages. Mosifeo did not take the story seriously. He categorized it as folklore mythology, a colorful anecdote to include in his journals. He did not consider that the Nulth might be describing an actual phenomenon. By the early 20th century, mountaineering expeditions, hunting parties, and logging operations were penetrating deeper into the Cascades and the Coast Ranges. Reports of strange footprints began appearing in local newspapers with increasing frequency. In 1924, a group of miners working in the Mount St. Helens area reported being attacked by a group of large hair-covered creatures that threw rocks at their cabin throughout the night. The incident occurred at a remote canyon that became known as Ape Canyon. The miners abandoned the site and never returned. The story was covered in the Portland Oregonian and the Seattle Times. Mainstream commentary was dismissive. Either the miners had been drinking, or they had encountered bears and panicked. But within indigenous communities, the story was unsurprising. The creatures the miners described matched existing descriptions of Sasq'ets. The behavior rock, throwing, nighttime, harassment, was consistent with traditional warnings about provoking forest spirits. One of the most significant moments in the cross-cultural translation of Sasquatch came in 1929, when a Canadian journalist named J.W. Burns published an article in Maclean's magazine titled "Introducing BC's Hairy Giants." Burns had spent years interviewing members of the Chehalis First Nation near Harrison Lake, British Columbia. He collected dozens of accounts and attempted to synthesize them for a non-Indigenous readership. It was Burns who popularized the anglicized term Sasquatch, a corruption of the Hul'qumi'lem Sasq'ets. His article framed the creature as a relic hominid, a surviving population of prehistoric humans that had retreated into the mountains to avoid contact with modern civilization. This framing Sasquatch as a missing link, a living fossil, it positioned the creature within an evolutionary narrative palatable to Western audiences. But it also stripped away the spiritual and cosmological dimensions that were central to indigenous understandings. The creature was no longer a guardian or a spiritual presence. It was a zoological curiosity, a specimen awaiting classification. This reductionism intensified after World War II as amateur cryptozoologists and adventure seekers began organizing expeditions explicitly to capture or kill a Sasquatch. In 1957, a wealthy Texas oilman named Tom Slick funded the first major Sasquatch expedition, operating in the forests of Northern California and Southern Oregon. Slick hired a team that included zoologists, trackers, and helicopter pilots. He offered a reward of $1,000 for verifiable evidence. The expedition found nothing conclusive, but it generated significant media coverage. Slick returned in 1959 with an even larger operation, this time targeting the Himalayas in search of the Yeti. The expeditions transformed Sasquatch from regional folklore into a subject of international curiosity. But they also reinforced the idea that the creature's value lay in its potential capture, not in the cultural knowledge surrounding it. The evidence for Sasquatch's physical existence is circumstantial, contested, and vast. Since the 1950s, researchers have compiled thousands of eyewitness reports, hundreds of plaster casts of footprints, dozens of hair samples, and several pieces of photographic and video evidence. None of it has been definitive. None of it has produced a body, a skeleton, or incontrovertible proof that would satisfy the standards of zoological verification. But the evidence has also resisted comprehensive debunking. The Patterson-Gimlin film remains the cornerstone. On the 20th of October 1967, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin were riding horses along Bluff Creek in the Six Rivers National Forest, roughly 40 miles south of the Oregon border. Patterson was a former rodeo rider and part-time freelance writer who had become obsessed with Sasquatch after reading Ivan T. Sanderson's 1961 book, Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life. He had self-published a book on the subject in 1966 and was in the process of shooting a low-budget documentary. Gimlin was a rancher and experienced outdoorsman who had agreed to accompany Patterson on the trip. They were investigating reports of footprints that had been found in the area by a road construction crew earlier that year. At approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, the men rounded a bend in the creek and saw a large figure crouched near the water. Patterson's horse reared. He fell, grabbed the camera from his saddlebag, and ran toward the figure, filming as he closed the distance. The figure stood, turned to look at the camera, and walked away with long, fluid strides. Patterson ran out of film after 59.5 seconds. The figure disappeared into the timber. Gimlin rode ahead and found tracks, 14 inches long, deeply impressed into the sand. They made plaster casts. The film was developed in Yakima, Washington, and screened for local media on the 22nd of October. Within days, it was national news. The film shows a massive bipedal figure covered in dark hair. The creature is estimated to be between 6 feet 6 inches and 7 feet 4 inches tall, weighing between 500 and 800 pounds. The body proportions are unusual: short legs relative to torso length, arms that hang well below the hips, a head that sits forward on the shoulders with no visible neck. As the creature walks, its muscles are visible moving beneath the skin. Gluteal flexion, quadriceps contraction, deltoid movement. The breasts of the creature sway slightly as it moves, leading most analysts to identify it as female. Frame analysis conducted in 1971 by Dr. Dmitry Donskoy, chief of the biomechanics laboratory at the USSR Central Institute of Physical Culture in Moscow, concluded that the gait pattern was consistent with a real bipedal creature, not a human in a costume. Dr. Grover Krantz, a physical anthropologist at Washington State University, who studied the film extensively, noted that the creature's center of mass, stride length, and arm swing were inconsistent with a human replicating the walk. He stated in his 1992 book, Bigfoot Prints, a scientific inquiry into the reality of Sasquatch, that if the film was a hoax, it would have required a costume of extraordinary sophistication, biomechanical expertise, far beyond what was available in 1967, and an actor capable of walking in a manner that violated normal human kinetics. In 1998, the film was analyzed by Jeff Meldrum, an associate professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. Meldrum focused on the foot mechanics visible in the film. In several frames, as the creature's foot lifts off the sand, the midfoot can be seen flexing, a biomechanical feature known as a mid-tarsal break. which is absent in modern humans, but present in great apes and some extinct hominids. Meldrum argued that this feature would be nearly impossible to fake with a costume or prosthetic foot, as it requires the actual bones of the foot to articulate in a non-human way. Skeptics have countered with a different narrative. In 2002, a man named Bob Hieronymus claimed that he had been the person in the suit hired by Patterson for $100. He said the suit was made by a costume designer in North Hollywood. However, Hieronymus could not provide any documentation, could not identify the costume shop, and his story contained inconsistencies. Subsequent attempts to recreate the Patterson Gimlin film using modern costumes and special effects have produced results that do not match the original in terms of muscle movement, gait fluidity, or anatomical proportion. A 2004 documentary produced by the BBC Sasq'ets, Legend Meets Science, commissioned a biomechanical analysis using motion capture technology and concluded that the figure in the film walked with a gait pattern that was outside the normal range for humans, even when accounting for costume bulk. The Patterson Gimlin film has been examined by more experts, subjected to more forensic scrutiny, and debated more intensely than any other piece of cryptid evidence in history. And after nearly 60 years, no one has been able to prove it is fake. The footprints, however, predate the film by decades. In August 1958, a bulldozer operator named Jerry Crew found a series of large human-like footprints at a road construction site near Bluff Creek. The prints were 16 inches long and embedded deeply in the dirt. Crew made a plaster cast and brought it to the office of the Humboldt Times in Eureka, California. The newspaper ran a front-page story on the 5th of October 1958, complete with a photograph of Crew holding the cast. The headline read, "Giant Footprints Puzzle Residents." The story was picked up by the Associated Press and went national. It was the first time the term Bigfoot appeared in print. Coined by a columnist for the Humboldt Times named Andrew Genzoli, the Bluff Creek area became a magnet for curiosity seekers. More prints were found. In 1960, a forestry worker named Bob Titmus returned to Bluff Creek and found a trackway over 1,000 feet long, descending from a ridge, crossing the creek, and climbing the opposite slope. The tracks showed variation in depth and spacing, consistent with a real creature adjusting its gait over uneven terrain. Titmus made casts of multiple prints, and these casts have since been analyzed by primatologists, forensic podiatrists, and biomechanics experts. In 1982, the U.S. Forest Service issued an internal memorandum acknowledging that personnel had encountered unexplained tracks on multiple occasions and instructing rangers to document such findings with photographs and measurements. The memo did not endorse the existence of Sasq'ets, but it recognized that something was leaving tracks that did not match any known wildlife. In 1995, a forestry worker near Walla Walla, Washington, found a set of tracks in fresh snow that included dermal ridges, fingerprint-like patterns visible in the skin of the foot. Officer Jimmy Chelcutt, a fingerprint expert with the Conroe Police Department in Texas, who specialized in primate dermal ridges, examined casts of the prints and stated that the ridge patterns were consistent with a real primate, not a fabricated mold. Hair samples have been collected from branches, fences, and the sites of reported encounters. In 2008, Dr. Henna Fahrenbach, a biomedical researcher in Oregon, compiled a database of over 30 hair samples that had been recovered from various locations across North America. DNA analysis of these samples yielded inconclusive results. Some identified the hair as belonging to known species, such as bear, elk, or human, while others returned results indicating contamination or degradation that rendered them untestable. However, none of the samples produced a definitive match to an unknown primate. In the summer of 2000, near the town of Skookum, Washington, a group of researchers from the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization placed apples, melons, and other bait in a muddy clearing and recorded the area overnight. In the morning, they found a large imprint in the mud, not a footprint, but what appeared to be a body cast, showing impressions of a forearm, hip, thigh, and heel. The cast weighed over 200 pounds and was transported to Idaho State University for analysis. Dr. Jeff Meldrum and a team of specialists examined it and noted that the anatomical features were consistent with a large primate lying on its side to reach the bait, rather than a known animal such as a bear or elk. Skeptics argued it could have been an elk lay, but the absence of hoof prints in the immediate area complicated that interpretation. The imprint remains in the university's collection, still debated. The transformation of Sasquatch from indigenous knowledge into American pop culture began with newspapers and pulp magazines, but it reached full saturation through film and television. In 1972, a low-budget horror film titled The Legend of Boggy Creek was released, documenting alleged sightings of a Bigfoot-like creature in Fuke, Arkansas. The film was shot in a pseudo-documentary style, mixing reenactments with interviews from local residents. It cost approximately $160,000 to produce and grossed over $20 million. It was one of the highest-grossing independent films of the decade and established the template for feature horror that would dominate the genre for years. Rural setting, working class witnesses. A creature that is more tragic than monstrous. The 1970s also saw the launch of The $6 Million Man, a popular television series in which one episode, titled The Secret of Bigfoot, aired in 1976 and became one of the highest-rated episodes of the show is run. The episode featured actor Andre the Giant in a Sasquatch costume, portraying the creature as an alien-engineered cyborg. The narrative bore no resemblance to traditional indigenous accounts, or even to the naturalist interpretation of Sasquatch as a relic hominid. The creature was science fiction, a prop in a Cold War-era action plot, but the episode introduced millions of viewers to the name and image of Bigfoot, cementing its place in the American cultural vocabulary. In 1987, the film Harry and the Hendersons reframed Sasquatch as a gentle, misunderstood giant. Directed by William Deere and produced by Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment, the film told the story of a suburban family that accidentally hits a Sasquatch with their car and brings it home, only to discover it is intelligent, kind, and vegetarian. The creature, named Harry, becomes a symbol of environmental consciousness and the dangers of human encroachment on wilderness. The film was a commercial success and later adapted into a television series that ran from 1991 to 1993. It marked a shift in how Sasquatch was portrayed, not as a monster or a missing link, but as a victim of human ignorance, a stand-in for endangered species more broadly. Video games introduced Sasquatch as an Easter egg, a hidden element that rewarded exploration. In the Grand Theft Auto series, specifically Grand Theft Auto V released in 2013, players could encounter a Sasquatch hidden in the wilderness of the game's fictional Pacific Northwest-inspired forests. The encounter was scripted, brief, and played for humor, but it reinforced the creature's status as an icon of the unknown, a reward for curiosity. The creature also appeared in Red Dead Redemption, The Sims, and numerous indie horror titles, each iteration stripping away more of the cultural and ecological specificity that originally defined it. By the 2000s, Sasquatch had become a brand. Jerky companies used its image, microbreweries named beers after it, tourism boards in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California erected roadside statues and promoted Bigfoot country as a destination. The creature was no longer a subject of serious inquiry or spiritual respect. It was kitsch, a marketing tool, a punchline. Television amplified this trajectory. In 2007, the History Channel premiered Monster Quest, a documentary series that investigated cryptid sightings using forensic analysis, interviews, and field expeditions. The Sasquatch episodes drew high ratings and helped launch a wave of similar programming. In 2011, Animal Planet debuted Finding Bigfoot, a reality series that followed a team of researchers as they investigated reports across North America. The show ran for 9 seasons and over 100 episodes, but it never produced conclusive evidence. The format prioritized drama and speculation over rigorous methodology, and critics accused the show of sensationalizing the subject and undermining serious research efforts. Yet the show also introduced thousands of people to the basic contours of Sasquatch evidence: footprints, vocalizations, eyewitness testimony, and some viewers went on to engage more deeply with the subject. Literature offered more nuanced treatments. In 1980, Peter Matthiessen published The Snow Leopard, a memoir of his trek through the Himalayas, in search of spiritual clarity. Though the book focused on Buddhism and grief rather than cryptozoology, Matthiessen included discussions of the Yeti and its cultural significance in Sherpa communities. The book won the National Book Award and brought a measure of literary respectability to the broader discourse around unknown hominids. In 2014, novelist Charlotte McConaughey published Once There Were Wolves, a sci-fi novel set in the Scottish Highlands that used the reintroduction of wolves as a metaphor for ecological restoration. Though not about Sasquatch directly, the novel explored themes central to cryptid discourse: wildness, loss, the human impulse to destroy what it cannot control. The creature has also appeared in horror fiction as a figure of pure menace. In 2018, Nick Cutter published The Deep, a novel that featured a Sasquatch-like entity as a manifestation of primal fear. The creature was no longer a relic hominid or a misunderstood forest dweller. It was a nightmare, an embodiment of the irrational terror that accompanies isolation and helplessness. This version of Sasquatch erased the indigenous context entirely and replaced it with a Lovecraftian horror framework, where the creature's existence represented not a mystery to be solved, but an incomprehensible otherness that could only be survived, never understood. What does it mean that Americans search for Bigfoot more than any other cryptid? More than the Loch Ness Monster? More than the Yeti? More than werewolves or chupacabras or Mothman? Google Trends data from 2010 to 2025 consistently shows that Sasquatch-related search terms outpace all competitors, peaking in the fall months, October and November, when the forests of the Pacific Northwest are at their darkest and the tourism season ends. The searches come from rural counties in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, but also from cities, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and from states far removed from Sasquatch's traditional range, Texas, Florida. The creature has become a national obsession, a symbol of something just beyond reach. Part of the appeal is the evidence itself: the Patterson, Gimlin film, the footprints, the vocalizations. They form a body of material that is substantial enough to feel real but ambiguous enough to resist closure. The creature occupies a space between proof and fantasy, a liminal zone where belief can exist without certainty. In an era of constant information, of satellites that can photograph a license plate from orbit, of cameras in every pocket, Sasquatch represents the last refuge of genuine mystery. It is a creature that could still be out there, in the few remaining places the modern world has not fully penetrated. But the obsession is not merely about mystery. It is about what the creature represents. For indigenous communities, Sasquatch has always been a reminder of balance, a guardian that enforces boundaries between human and non-human worlds. For non-indigenous Americans, the creature has become a symbol of wilderness itself, not the managed, controlled wilderness of national parks, but the real thing, the unruly, dangerous, unobserved forest that refuses to be catalogued. Sasquatch is what persists when the roads end. It is a rebuke to the idea that every square mile of the continent has been mapped, commodified, and understood. In 2016, a survey conducted by Chapman University found that over 11% of Americans believed in the existence of Bigfoot. That figure rose to nearly 16% among respondents under the age of 35. The belief was not correlated with education level, income, or political affiliation. It cut across demographics. Some of that belief is playful, a willingness to entertain the possibility rather than a firm conviction. But for a significant subset, the belief is sincere, grounded in personal experience, or in a distrust of institutional authority. If the government and scientific establishment have been wrong before, about the dangers of pesticides, about the origins of certain diseases, about the honesty of corporate-funded research, then Perhaps they are wrong about Sasquatch too. The creature becomes a stand-in for broader skepticism, a way of asserting that official narratives do not have a monopoly on truth. Environmentalists have invoked Sasquatch as a mascot for habitat conservation. In 2010, a coalition of environmental groups in Washington state used the creature's image in a campaign to protect old-growth forest from logging. The argument was simple. These forests are so intact, so remote, that they could still harbor an undiscovered species. Whether or not Sasquatch exists, the forests themselves deserve protection. The creature's value lay not in its physical existence, but in what it represented. An argument for restraint, for leaving some places alone. The campaign succeeded in preserving over 50,000 acres of timberland from commercial harvest. The creature also functions as a psychological mirror. Encounters with Sasquatch are almost always solitary or involve small groups. The creature appears, is observed briefly, and then disappears. Witnesses are left with a story they cannot prove, an experience that isolates them from those who were not there. This structure, brief encounter, lingering uncertainty, social alienation, mirrors the experience of trauma, of witnessing something that exceeds one's ability to process it, and then being disbelieved. Some psychologists have suggested that Sasquatch sightings may represent a kind of projection, a way for individuals to externalize feelings of fear, or loneliness onto an ambiguous figure. But this interpretation, while plausible in some cases, does not account for the physical evidence. The tracks, the hair, the consistent anatomical descriptions across unconnected witnesses. And it is here, in the space between physical trace and psychological projection, that Sasquatch endures. It is neither fully material nor fully imagined. It is the question that will not resolve, and perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the creature's greatest gift is not proof of its existence, but the preservation of doubt, the insistence that the world is still larger than our understanding of it. In the forests of the Pacific Northwest, where the canopy blocks out the sun and the sound of running water masks all other noise, where a person can walk for days without seeing another human, something still moves between the trees. It may be a remnant population of Gigantopithecus, a species of great ape thought to have gone extinct 300,000 years ago. It may be a previously unknown hominid, a branch of the evolutionary tree that split from Homo sapiens and adapted to a life of solitude and silence. It may be nothing at all, an aggregate of bare sightings, hoaxes, and wishful thinking. But the fact that we still search, that we still cast footprints in plaster and analyze blurry footage frame by frame, suggests that the question itself has become more important than the answer. To search for Sasquatch is to assert that there are still edges to the map, still regions where the wilderness has not been tamed. It is to believe, however, cautiously, that we have not yet seen everything there is to see. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.